the circadian disruption piece is something that many people completely gloss over. And furthermore, they don't understand that all anti-cancer processes in the body are under circadian control. So autophagy, apoptosis, P53 is a tumor suppressor gene. All of these things that are designed to protect you against cancer are under circadian control, which means that sunlight cannot inherently cause any form of cancer. In fact, it's protective because it optimizes those processes in the body.
Zaid, welcome to the show. And firstly, I just want to say thank you for your work. I found you on Instagram, and we're going to dive in today for the viewers a whole bunch on skin cancer, cancer, the sun, and to my mind, a lot of misunderstanding. And as we just said off air, the memes around the sun being harmful and bad for you, which
Mm.
is somewhat crazy when you think it's the source of all life, and the source of all life being bad for us is an interesting viewpoint. But to start off with, how did you become interested in this topic?
Well, I was a very obsessed athlete growing up, inspired by my father, who also ties into the story of how I got into circadian biology and health in general. But yeah, I started playing soccer or football for the European audience at the age of 4, and then from there I pursued it probably around 22, 24 years obsessively, single-mindedly. And I think that that's really informed how I approach a lot of the work that I do now. But either way, I mean that's taught me so much about life, about myself, about mastery. And so towards the latter part of that experience, around 18, 19 years old, while I was still actively playing in England, my father experienced 2 heart attacks within the span of a year. And so that's what really led me down the holistic health rabbit hole. And then a few years later, I found Dr. Jack Cruz with, Huberman, Rick Rubin, that specific episode, which blew my mind wide open. And from there, I've just been focused on circadian principles and circadian biology. And, it's taken a life of its own, but I do approach this in the same manner, single mindedly, obsessively. And I'm really obsessed and passionate about just making sure people have a more comprehensive understanding of what's going on, especially in relation to skin cancer or, solar spectrum, whatnot. And so, yeah, that's my background. I think it's something a lot of people resonate with because a lot of people experience, whether it be their own health issues or family members who have their own health issues, maybe prematurely dying and whatnot. And so that's kind of, yeah, how I'd like to break down.
Yep. I'd like to just preface this conversation to start with is we're going to be going to topics and they're all nuanced. So, to my mind, it's about using your discretion, educating yourself, and I feel what's so lacking, particularly in this sphere, but obviously with social media and all spheres in general, is conversations become completely binary. It's a yes or a no, and I just want to say like that's not at all. I don't know. Either our intent is to say this good, this bad. It's all nuance, where you live, heritage, so on. But certainly, I want to hear, like, let's start with solar, the sun, because here in Australia, and I know it's probably similar where you are in California, the meme in Australia is very much the sun is dangerous, it's bad. You need to either be covered up at all hours, you need to be wearing sunscreen, sunglasses, to the point of where I see here people in winter, when it's the time of year you need to be getting vitamin D, walking around with full length clothing on, sunglasses at 6 a.m. The sun's barely gotten up. So let's unpack that. Let's unpack the. I know it's a very large thing to unpack, but what's your first take of how it's been propositioned that the sun is bad?
Well, I honestly believe that it is people's understanding of full spectrum sunlight in relation to the quote unquote dangers to human health are they stem from a full on propaganda assault on the human population. And when you first hear me say that, this might sound very conspiratorial, but this is all stuff that you can find in the historical literature, and it's stuff that you can find backed up very easily. And so if you look at the early 1900s when we had heliotherapy, this huge boom of scientific literature and in scientific cases where sunlight would quite literally heal some of the most craziest diseases known to man. I mean, tuberculosis, lupus vulgaris, tuberculosis of the skin, so forth. And so I think understanding that part of history is very important. Understanding how the 1910 Flexner report, made by some of the most powerful men at the time, centralized medicine and then, led to a more allopathic bias in the world, or at least in the world of medicine. And then from there, you have the 50s, 60s, 70s, where you have certain companies like L'Oreal and Nestle who have actively created PR campaigns, otherwise what I call propaganda campaigns, to convince the public that, full spectrum sunlight is inherently damaging so that they can sell more sunscreen, creams, whatever products that they're selling on the back end. And it also ties into centralized dermatology and how they actually got their start as being perceived as, these skin cancer fighters. They actually, hired a PR campaign back, I think in the 50s or 60s, to make themselves out to be that. And so I think there's a lot of holes in the historical perspective on that end, which has led to iatrogenic uh, intervention in the sense of, iatrogenesis just basically describes second or third order harm. It can be any consequence, really, that manifests as a result of direct recommendation from a medical professional. And that can either be conscious or unconscious. So a doctor might know that they're handing out iatrogenic advice, or they might not. And so that's just a few things off the top of my head. I think it's just been a full-on assault on the population to be convinced of something otherwise.
God, there's a bit for me, a few different directions. They used to have, and people forget this. Well, it's probably been washed away as pseudoscience, but as you alluded to, the sunbeds. They used to put people out, particularly in Europe, after the First World War and Second World War, were literally to receive sun as a healing therapy, and very effectively.
Mm-hmm.
So it's quite startling how we've gotten from there to where we are today, where people will literally avoid the sun at all costs. And then but the irony being, we know the studies with vitamin D deficiencies, because most people are aware, for example, they should be supplementing with vitamin D, which comes with a whole host of other issues. So there's an awareness that the hormone, missing vitamin D as a hormone, can lead to cancers and so on.
Yeah.
And yet the narrative is we need to avoid the one thing which will promote that hormone.
And I would pose a question to the audience, like, how did we go from, the work of Niels Ryberg Finson, who was the original person who studied the relationship between sunlight and human biology? How did we go from that to the work of Dr. Augusto Rollier, who was the first classical heliotherapist, who would actually, recommend sunbathing at high altitude, a lot more UV light in order to heal a lot of these deadly conditions? How did we go from that to all of a sudden demonizing sunbathing, demonizing tanning, which is just melanin production, and just telling people to avoid the sun and start using all these sunscreens and sunglasses and whatnot? I think if we understand what happened between that time period, the early 1900s, all the way up to, like, let's say the 1950s, 60s, then we'll have a more accurate description of really what's going on and how I think the population has been manipulated.
I was trying to think of the direction. I think let's start with that. So, and then we can move into the benefits of the sun and why it's essential. But we were just saying before we started, I'm going to play devil's advocate here. So in Australia, we have the highest rates incidence of skin cancer, and it's actually been steadily rising since the 1980s. And if you
Mm.
read Wikipedia on that, it will say because the reason why it's risen, well, part of the reason why it's risen is the ability to detect skin cancer has improved. So maybe it was equally as high previously. And then if you think of it logically, okay, we've got a high European diaspora for people who are native to this country. And if you look at the indigenous peoples here, they obviously have a lot of melanin in their skin to deal with being outside in very harsh UV here.
Mm.
So if you think of their argument, it makes a lot of logical sense that the cause of this is high UV for peoples who are not meant to be in that situation. Yet, if you delve a bit more deeply, you'll see that there's also a lot of Scandinavian countries whose skin cancer is very much on the rise. And let me just finish this thought and I'll get you to jump in. But then there's a whole bunch of other corollaries which are not put in place. So, obesity has risen in stratospheric terms in Australia, outpacing even America, to where 70% of adults are obese. And I can't remember what the number of children is, and that's from the 1980s, but specifically from the early 2000s. And then the introduction of campaigns like Slip, Slop, Slap, and all these sunscreens, which are known carcinogens. Like the amount of sunscreens each year, if you just do a quick Google search on how many sunscreens each year are removed from market because they find yet another carcinogenic within it, That campaign actually perfectly aligns with this, also the rise in skin cancers, which was early 1980s. So I'm not positing anything in terms of like blaming one particular cause. I think it's a nuance, but it's very
Yeah.
interesting that none of these are taken into account when we're talking about it's just the one thing, which is UV. Uh, so what would you say to that? Like, how do you look at these cofactors to, and pass them?
It's a great question. I do agree with you in the sense that it is multifactorial. It's nonsense to say that it's one cause, leading to these sort of manifestations. Number one, as you mentioned, like, with the history of Australia and New Zealand, talking about British colonies and having people who are inherently of, British or European descent in a high UV index environment, that needs to be considered. Now, I do think that those people can actually thrive in that sort of environment with a proper circadian framework. But you have to be a lot more intentional about what you do and how you approach your lifestyle. Because fundamentally, lighter skinned people can develop melanin as well. They just have to be a little bit more intentional rather than compared to darker skinned people, because darker skinned people just thrive in high UV index environments generally. Outside of that, you mentioned the obesity. If we're talking about any form of cancer, any form of chronic disease, you have to consider the comorbidities that people are dealing with. Obesity being the number one comorbidity that absolutely destroys the human body from every angle and systemically. Um, you have, the discussion of sunscreen causing skin cancer is something I hear a lot of. I don't actively believe that. I think that there's a lot more nuance involved. But we do have to consider that there are photocarcinogens within those chemical-based sunscreens, meaning that, the compound itself may not be inherently carcinogenic, but when you put it onto the skin in a high UV index environment with a lot of heat, it actually activates those compounds to become photocarcinogens. And so that's something to be considered over the lifetime of the individual. And then, of course, the big ones that I talk about so much is the circadian disruption, the isolated blue light, especially at night, and the indoor lifestyle. Because in the United States, last time I checked, 90 to 95% of our time is spent indoors, which just throws the entire idea that sunlight inherently causes skin cancers or any of these problems out the window, because of the fact that people are just not outside getting sun, right? And so I think that also plays a big part in Australia and New Zealand. And there are probably some other things that I'm not considering right now off the top of my head, but I think the circadian disruption piece is something that many people completely gloss over. And furthermore, they don't understand that all anti-cancer processes in the body are under circadian control. So autophagy, apoptosis, P53 is a tumor suppressor gene. All of these things that are designed to protect you against cancer are under circadian control, which means that sunlight cannot inherently cause any form of cancer. In fact, it's protective because it optimizes those processes in the body. And so that's what I'm trying to get people to understand, is that circadian alignment and understanding how to approach circadian biology, especially depending on your latitude, skin type, all that, is the most important and fundamental piece to protect yourself from these manifestations.
Okay, let's go into circadian biology and how people can enhance it, and also just a quick, for someone who's never even come across that term, a bit of an overview. But I just want to quickly circle back to the sunscreen. The other factor which I missed was there's two things. The introduction of blue light really started to accelerate across the world in the early thousands. So that too, more and more to the point of where you can't even get the incandescent globes anymore in Australia. You need to buy the blue light globes. So it's prolific everywhere. And then sunscreen, something that a lot of people don't think. When you're, particularly here in Australia, if you're outdoors in summer, in 15 minutes you'll start to feel yourself almost burning. Like you'll have an actual bodily reaction which will be telling you to remove yourself from the sun and take shade. You've had enough, depending on your previous exposure. But I see people here who come from colder parts of the country, lather themselves in sunscreen, and then lie out for hours and hours and hours on end and not actually burn, yet they're doing a similar damage due to just overexposure to UV without any
Yeah, and I would honestly say it might be a little bit worse than that, because I don't think people consider the fact that sunscreen does actually change the spectrum of the sun. And so, in my opinion, it changes the spectrum in a more harmful way. You're blocking UVA and UVB, but there's even options that block infrared, which is crazy in my mind nowadays. But then, what is it doing to the high energy blue light wavelengths? that also penetrates the skin. And so, in the same fashion that we think of low emission glass being very damaging to the skin barrier because of that altered spectrum, we have to consider sunscreen on the same end as well.
You know that famous when people pull up. If you look at any skincare company, or they have a famous, they do an article on sun exposure in your skin, and they have that famous image of a lady who was working on a road. What do you call it? When cars are coming through a booth and she's taking the money, and she was always exposed one side of her face to the sun coming through the glass, and that side is dramatically more aged than the side that was in the shade.
Mhm.
Yet, as you just alluded to, the glass is blocking out certain frequencies of UV, which actually accelerates skin aging. And then when you're getting the full spectrum of the sun, it doesn't have the same reaction to the skin. So again, it's a far more complicated picture of what causes aging and skin damage as opposed
Yeah.
to UV.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
it's shocking once you understand that because it just flips the entire narrative on its head.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it destroys their model entirely. Uh, it completely destroys it. But okay, circadian rhythm. Why is it so important, and how can people improve it?
I'd say from a high level, we have to understand that every aspect of the body is circadian in nature. So, you could talk about the mitochondria being light sensing organelles that are under circadian control. Every organ, cell, tissue, protein in the body is under circadian control, which means that sunlight is inherently positive or beneficial to every aspect of the body because sunlight is what we call a Zeitgeber or an external circadian cue that aligns the circadian system systemically. And so that's a very important thing to understand. It's like the light and dark cycle are a necessary duality to the circadian system. And you can essentially view the body as one intricate set of clocks because circadian biology and circadian rhythms are all about timing. And so the body is basically picking up on light cues, other cues in the environment to set the clocks either appropriately or inappropriately. So, full spectrum sunlight in the morning or just watching sunrise in general is something that's going to align the circadian system. And artificial light at night is an example of light being improperly used to destroy the timing of the circadian system. And outside of that, I would say, if I were to break it down simply, it's essentially just a 24-hour cycle that your body follows that is controlled by the movement of the sun and the moon. And that I think is about as simple as you can get. But every aspect of the body is circadian in nature.
So, how has modernity destroyed this?
Well, it's basically inverted that bright days outside and dark nights after nightfall. And so we have dark days now because people spend 90 to 95% of their time indoors. And we have very bright nights because of the advent of artificial light, most notably within the isolated blue spectrum. And so as a circadian species, we have through modernity and through technology, we have basically inverted the way our circadian rhythms and circadian biology is supposed to work. And as a result, I think that creates so many downstream consequences, whether it be, dramatically increased rate of cancer. There's research showing that artificial light at night actually does cause cancer in human beings. So that's another one to consider about skin cancer. And, just go down the list: heart disease, neurodegeneration, even down to more acute symptoms like brain fog, poor sleep. I think it's just destroying us from every which angle you can think about.
Also, another big one I see, macular degeneration, particularly with people who spend a lot of time in front of screens. Because my old industry as a photographer, you'd get a lot of people who had to edit with perfect color balance that always had the blue light. Uh, and you just see everyone I know who's done that long term have trouble with their eyes.
Yeah, I've
Yeah.
seen the same exact thing.
Yeah. Um, God, so how do we, what's some low hanging fruit to start untangling this mess? And really, I think also to really, as you just alluded to, really ram home, because I've spoken to people about this and it doesn't quite land with them the importance of cutting the blue light, not only if you can during the day, but at night. Like as soon as that dusk has fallen and the light and the sun has dropped from the sky, like you should be mitigating all blue light absolutely as much as possible. Overhead lights, computer screens, phones. I've sort of answered my own
Yeah,
question there. Sorry.
no, no, and it makes complete sense in my mind. I think that it depends on the individual that we're talking about. Like, what do they care about most, right? I think that I can present any bit of evidence to what somebody really cares about, whether it's, somebody who wants to lose weight. Okay, we can talk about the pro-opium-melanocortin system and how blue light at night completely destroys all of your hormones, destroys the POMC system and in the peptide hormones that's created off of that. We could talk about how isolated blue light increases blood sugar and insulin independent of food, meaning you do not have to eat a single calorie of food um, to raise your blood sugar and insulin if you are under that blue light at night, which is a pretty crazy thing to think about because, how many people are pre-diabetic, type 2 diabetic? How many people need extra insulin because of the fact that they are under this harsh blue LED or, fluorescent lighting at night or even during the day? And so I think it depends on the individual, but there is an answer for every single manifestation that human beings deal with, at least from a chronic disease perspective.
So what do you recommend? So say this has landed for somebody and they've not considered it, but it's finally landing. What's the go-to points for you to start cleaning up their home environment? Let's say the work environment's out of control. Unfortunately, most people are
Mm.
in conditions where they're not able to control the office lights or whatever their work situation is. They get home. What can they start doing instantly to implement better circadian rhythm?
Yeah, I always tell people like the science can get very crazy. It can get very complex, but I think the action steps that people can take away to implement into their lifestyle are actually very straightforward and simple. Number one, watching sunrise is the most important thing you could do, bar none, because that is what sets the circadian system in alignment, and that is what everything results from that point forward. And so I call it the first domino that you essentially want to push in order to make sure that metabolism, blood sugar regulation, mental function, sleep is just on point from that standpoint. So watching sunrise, making sure to get as much of the skin and eyes exposed to that morning spectrum, which has a host of benefits, whether it's priming your skin to handle more UV during midday, creating the very neurotransmitters and hormones that you depend on for quality of life, or just getting better sleep, which will enhance recovery, enhance muscle building, longevity, whatnot. And then outside of that, I would say microdosing, that UV light initially is very important. So we don't want to burn. I'm not an advocate of burns. I think that's just an extension or overextension of somebody's skin, uh, according to what they're currently adapted for. So in kind of the same light as weight training, we want to use progressive overload to gradually build up strength and resilience against a certain stressor. And then outside of that, yeah, just the light, making it dark after nightfall is huge. So using circadian friendly lighting, whether it's incandescents, beeswax candles, going to a more natural and evolutionary appropriate spectrum of light is the key, but you have to maintain as much darkness as possible. So that's why I say minimal circadian friendly lighting. Um, and that I think that will align most people with the light and dark cycle adequately, and that'll get people maybe 70 to 80% of the way there in terms of effect.
Hmm. Do you advocate for things like iris tech and these applications that you can put on your computer to cut blue light? Have you dug into how effective they are?
Oh yeah, Iris, Flux, One Tap Zap on Gumroad from my friend Rusty is a great resource. All of these things I think, will create a healthier relationship that you have to technology. Um, and then outside of that, I would say the only thing that I've seen many holes in is actually the standard Apple or Android blue light blocking filters or whatever they call it. That has been shown to actually still suppress melatonin very strongly, and so that's something I recommend avoiding. But those are all great tools. In the same way that a dark lens pair of blue light blockers are after sunset, in the same way that something as simple as opening the window when you're inside will actually make a huge difference. So yeah, definitely.
It's also, and you mentioned at the beginning with getting the sunrise, getting that morning sun. Like good sleep begins in the morning. It's
Exactly. We want to view the day holistically, which only makes sense, right? Like the nighttime begins in the morning, and what you do in the morning has a massive impact on the downstream hormonal and neurotransmitter and whatnot effects that end up creating the quality of sleep that you have.
shoe. Where does grounding fit in? Like taking your shoes off and placing your feet on the earth for half an hour. There's so many like great studies on this with linking your circadian.
Yeah, so I'm a big advocate of grounding. Obviously, I think that it actually does have a circadian aligning effect independent of the work that we just discussed. I think there was this researcher that was maybe 70s, 80s who actually placed people in a bunker, and he would test whether the individual was connected to alternative current or direct current, DC coming from the Earth. And he found that actually their circadian rhythms were completely aligned when they actually were connected to the Earth underground, independent of any sunlight whatsoever, which is pretty incredible to think about. So I view grounding as kind of like a natural add-on to your sun exposure, whether it be in the morning time, midday. You do have to be a little bit more careful about where you ground, especially if you're in a city, because there's all sorts of like electrical cables underground now. You have 5G towers and cell towers close to you, and so that stuff is to be considered. And I'm always an advocate of following the inverse square law, which means whatever the source of native or non-native EMF, distance essentially protect you the most, because the effect or the power of that signal is going to drop off exponentially. And so the more distance you can place between you and cell towers or 5G transmitters, the better. But either way, grounding is absolutely incredible from what I've seen.
It's pretty tough to distance yourself in almost any major Western city now from 5G towers. Sadly,
Yeah,
let's uh,
and
let's
some
let
people hypothesize that there is a protective effect from grounding. I don't know about that, but
yeah.
either way, I think it's just beneficial to do.
Yeah. There's a number of things I've read where certain things are meant to be beneficial in protective mechanisms. Certainly not making yourself overly anxious about it. It's not going to help the situation any either.
Yeah. And by the way, I do want to mention this because a lot of people think grounding is pseudoscience. There's a lot of research. I mean, and look, let's like even step out of, let's say, the PubMed studies that have been run by grounding companies. You have very strong pieces of evidence like biological semiconduction, piezoelectricity, flexoelectricity. The body is essentially an electromagnetic, let's say, system. And so the grounding is going to be a very key part of that. And every aspect of the body is really designed to use and uptake those free electrons from the earth.
I mean, we're from the Earth. Why would we? Why would be putting plastic between yourself and the Earth be a good idea?
So true.
It's
Yeah.
it's pretty crazy how we just adopt things unquestioningly that are to do with technology or being in the modern world now as the and anything that falls outside of that suddenly becomes pseudoscience as opposed
How,
to
how convenient for the centralized system.
yeah, how very convenient for people trying to sell you more stuff that makes you sick. But in terms of let's go into the sun because I think and sensible the reason why we need the sun, how it can work mechanistically in the body, and then how, as you mentioned it, like building up, as in doing pushing as you would in the gym and building muscle, like building more and more sun exposure over time in a sensible way that's not harmful. And I just want to quickly preface because I was interested. I read this. Everyone thinks that dermatology and dermatologists are aligned on the sun causing UV being causing cancer. Like if you actually have a deeper look, there's a lot of sort of what would be considered outlier dermatologists who don't believe that at all.
Yeah.
But they get pushed very quickly to the margins of the fraternity as pariahs. So it's certainly not. I'm just trying to frame it. It's not some consensus view from all dermatology that the sun is.
Yeah. And even if it was a consensus, I mean, it's very easy to poke holes in their understanding of this work. It really is. And, a lot of people hear me say that and they might seem that they might think that I'm arrogant, but I can assure you, if you put enough hours in research into this, you will find a lot more holes in their philosophy than you would, like to imagine, essentially.
Even from their own studies though, which is kind
Yeah.
of funny. Like if you actually, some of the studies sort of contradict each other in terms of what they're saying. If you, because I've not gone as deep as you, but I mentioned off air, like I had a melanoma about, I can't remember, over a decade ago. So I ended up, rather than continually going to the dermatologist as was recommended every 6 months and freaking out that I might have another ticking time bomb, uh, I actually started to look at the studies and even I just sort of broke them down logically, and they didn't make a lot of sense epidemiologically when you looked at what they were measuring for and ignoring a whole bunch of other cofactors, as you mentioned at the start of the show, which weren't included. How can you make this conclusion when you're excluding 90% of the information?
It's crazy. It's
They
absolutely
didn't even measure what people ate.
no, no.
So
And
like. Yeah.
And that's the thing. I think if you look through, like, when a lot of dermatologists throw out these one-liners of like, oh, if you get a sunburn in early age, like your chance of getting melanoma increases by 400% or something. Like you look into that and you look into the other things that they're saying, and it's all associational, it's all observational, which means that it's a poor quality level of evidence. And it's certainly, I think, if you stack the higher quality evidence in favor of sunlight compared to that, it just like like how can it even be argued?
Well, how are people in Norway getting melanomas on the bottom of their feet
Exactly.
if it's, at a high incidence? I'm not talking as that this is some random one off. Like the incidence of melanomas in these countries are rising rapidly, and they're still blaming UV.
Yeah. Or vitamin D3, endogenous melatonin, circadian disruption. They just completely gloss over all this.
Yeah. So let's go. Why do we need the sun?
Well, I think we need the sun because we are a circadian species. We are diurnal at heart and in our nature, which means we're supposed to be awake during the day and asleep during the night. And that, I mean, you're talking about hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary adaptation to create a system such as a human being, to get us to this point. And so sunlight was always a key part of that. It's quite literally the source of life for all of, organisms in life on this planet. And it holds the food web together. And so if we go through like what the actual solar spectrum is, you can talk about the benefits of UVA and UVB. UVA making nitric oxide in the body, which lowers blood pressure. UV in general stimulating the POMC system, which is basically like the most powerful drug factory that we know to man, and that ends up creating a bunch of peptide hormones that are appetite suppressants, metabolism boosters, anti-inflammatory, antioxidants. It's absolutely incredible when you study the POMC system, which needs UV light to be activated, and then you get into even biophoton emission, UVC created within the body from the mitochondria, which is very important. And then you move out of the UV range, go into the visible range. Every wavelength within the visible range offers immense benefit. Red, green, blue, all of these wavelengths have evolved or co-evolved with the human body to provide benefit systemically. Um, and so I think every light wavelength offers benefit to the human body, but even more than that, the synergistic effect of these wavelengths coming together is something that science still hasn't grasped yet. And I sent you that study about near infrared actually stopping UV toxicity completely after like 3 sessions, which is crazy, but there is a synergistic relationship here as well.
Tap on that quickly. So,
Yeah.
are you implying, is that more to do with UV, uh, red light exposure through a device, or you can also get the same in the morning sunlight? Just quickly explain it. So, to my understanding, it was like getting that form of infrared light earlier in the day actually prevents damage from UV later on in the day, in a very simplistic.
Exactly. There's a lot of evidence to that point. The study I sent you specifically was actually an in vitro study, and so people can make the argument that it is a poor level quality of evidence. But the assumptions that centralized dermatology is using are in vitro or on nocturnal animals. So I'm providing an in vitro model that's showing that if you combine near infrared initially, if you pre-irradiate those skin cells with near infrared, they become very protected against UV toxicity, which throws the entire centralized model out the window, which just uses isolated UV. And so that's why I tell people to start sunbathing in the morning time around sunrise, before 8 or 9 a.m. generally, depending on latitude, because that will prime the circadian clocks within the skin and it'll prime the skin independently so that you can handle more UV. And I've seen this play out countless times in many different people, whether it be redheads, people who are blue-eyed, blonde-haired, darker-skinned individuals. It works across the board, which only makes sense considering we're a circadian species. And so that's the important point. It's just like there is no UV light in isolation in nature, especially not from the sun. And so if you look at the total spectrum, UV only makes about 3 to 5% of the total spectrum at all times, even at the equator, at the highest UV index time. The rest, 42 to 45% is in the visible range, and then 50 to 55+% is in the infrared. And so even if you look at near infrared, which is around 20 to 22%, you compare that near infrared 20 to 22% versus the UV, which is 3 to 5%. It tells you that nature is basically balancing this out so that you get all the benefit from a circadian standpoint. And so I think full spectrum sunlight is it's a hormetic stressor. It's beneficial to the human body. You have to approach it correctly. But furthermore, I think it goes even beyond that. It's just so fundamental to overall health.
I remember reading one study as well, just eating a diet high in fruits and vegetables, basically high antioxidant, clean food, also helps your body, protects you from UV, from more harmful elements of UV. So then if we're bringing in again people eating unhealthy diets which are causing them obesity, which are full of absolute crap, it makes perfect sense once again logically that if you're doing that, you've got zero protection from UV when you do go out into the sun, and you've also probably been under blue light and you've done no preparation, and you'll burn very easily.
Yeah.
uh,
It,
yeah,
it just makes more sense from every angle.
it really does. It really does. But look, I don't want to also go too psyop on it, but I'm sort of left with no option. How are very intelligent people who have gone through med school, not, I mean, not asking themselves these questions? I mean, that's sort of startling to me. Other than we're all got our own incredible cognitive biases based on the indoctrination we've received.
Yeah, it is a very interesting subject. I think that, again, we have to look back at the 1910 Flexner report. Abraham Flexner, John D. Rockefeller, and then what was the other individual? Andrew Carnegie. They actively created this report in essentially to centralize medicine. And so they wanted to, sorry?
No, so I was going to say to sell more oil, but I could do, just for people who haven't heard of that, just give a quick. You kind of were going into it. Just give a quick overview of what that actually meant for medicine at the time.
Yeah, exactly. So they wanted to centralize medicine to gather more control, to sell more of an allopathic bias or approach to doctors in order to essentially make money and gain more power. I mean, that's what it comes down to. If you look at modern pharmaceuticals directly tied into Rockefeller's oil company, and a lot of these drugs are made from petroleum, and so that's an important consideration. But even worse than that, Rockefeller also played a huge part, and I'm sure the other individuals did as well, of creating the educational system involved. And so not only do you have centralized medicine, but you also have the centralized education framework that ties directly into that apparatus, which means that all of the doctors of today, all of the specialists of today have a real bias towards allopathic medicine. This is why you don't find holistic health principles in hospitals. They don't recommend any of that because of the history involved. And I think that's just egregious. It creates a perfect storm of iatrogenesis. In 2016, iatrogenic harm was like the third leading cause of death in the US,
Hmm.
which is crazy to think about.
It's
And so I
400,000.
think
I think it's
it's
400,000 a year in the US,
it's just mind blowing.
which is mind-boggling. Well, people were losing their shit over supposed deaths from COVID, which we can in another podcast. But it was for a long time. It was actually just tracking with malpractice, deaths from malpractice within hospital.
And that's like either serious harm or death caused by your doctor because they either don't know what they're talking about or they're pushing something that is going to create second and third order consequences.
They actively went, and up until that early 1900s, we had the ability to use more holistic treatments, and they actually systemically went through and started banning them one by one. And that's where the term actually pseudoscience came from, and it was and quackery. It was just such an easy way to dismiss people with a view that inconveniently did not fit with the model of take this pill and you'll be fine.
Yeah. And only a few years prior to 1910. I mean, you're talking about 1903, 1904, 05. Niels Ryberg Finson and Augusto Rollier were healing, lupus vulgaris. I mean, you're talking about people who were on the edge of death, like 2 weeks away from death. They implemented a sunbathing protocol at high altitude in Switzerland, and all of a sudden, 4 or 5, 6 months later, these people are fully healed with a nice tan. So explain that to me. Like I think it completely goes against the centralized model of today, and it is a direct threat to the pockets of these individuals or the system at large, which I think it makes sense from that standpoint.
It's probably if I'm feeling a bit on whatever might be happening in my body, the first thing I actually go to is just increasing a bit of sun exposure, and it generally sorts it out very quickly.
Yeah.
Uh, I just want to go back to sensible sun exposure just to give a quick uh, implementation that I did myself. So I live somewhere which is for the most part sunny all year. except when it's not, when it's raining for a month on end. But I literally started with, as you said, like I would do earlier in the day, maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, never got burnt. To now where I do have a tan, and I can, in the wintertime, I can be in the sun all day without getting any form of burn. But even then, even after doing that for 3 years now, I'm still in summer. I won't go out and sit in the sun for more than 45 to an hour because I can feel
Yeah.
it's that strong. But you have a natural mechanism where your body will scream at you when you can feel that happening because you're actually in tune with the sun. And I'm not obviously native to this land, so there is a certain time limit. Because the other problem I also see is if you hop on socials, I'll hear people say the opposite extreme of do what you want, get as much sun as you like. I'm in the sun all day. Equally, depending on your heritage, that is terrible advice, and your how you've built up to it and so on. So as you said, like it's got to be nuanced, but you can certainly depend, regardless as you said where you're from, you can build a skin tolerance based on your heritage, which is going to see you thrive in that environment. And then put on a shirt and put on a hat. Like
It's
even
not hard for us.
well, even indigenous people here didn't go running around at midday for hours on end. It's when they'll be resting.
Exactly. And I think a great example of this is to look at what animals in nature do. They seek sun and then they seek shade. And so it's like it's the same duality as the light and dark cycle. Like you seek sun and then you seek shade. And shade can mean like you're literally under a tree or you're inside or you're just putting on, clothing and a hat. And so I think that's a very under discussed portion of this because I feel like a lot of centralized thinkers, especially the medical professionals and dermatologists, they think that people like me are just recommending, oh, you can spend 7+ hours in the highest UV index at the equator. Like, no, that's nonsense. Um, I'm bringing more sensible understanding to this work so that people don't burn and that they build melanin.
Yeah, and improve all aspects of the health in their process.
Exactly.
Yeah. So look, on the positive side, what I am seeing is people like yourself, and there's far more education getting out there about the necessity of getting correct sun exposure. And certainly in communities where I am, there's a lot more awareness where people, you don't see so many, if possible, shoes where necessary, when not necessary, so the other big one, do you want to touch upon is sunglasses and the potential pitfalls of wearing I've actually somewhat shifted slightly. I think in very high UV I used to be very much no sunglasses ever. Now I think depending on the time of day and the UV index, like I might wear them for an hour if I'm out unavoidably outside in the sun. But just from a mechanistic perspective, what's the issue with blocking UV, particularly in the morning with sunglasses?
Yeah, it's a good question, which is why I like to bring the nuance when it comes to sunscreen or sunglasses. But with sunglasses, the if we follow the logic that the ocular system was designed or evolved for full spectrum sunlight, just by the mere nature of being outside, then it doesn't necessarily make sense, or it doesn't make sense at all to chronically wear sunglasses 24/7, which is how most people use them because of PR campaigns from these big companies and whatnot. I think that number one, you have the fact that UV light acts non-linearly in the body, which means that a small stimulus can have a massive effect within a system. And the system of the human body really desires UV light. That's why we have non-visual photoreceptors all over the body, most notably neuropsin, which actually detects and senses UVA to go about systemic function. And then, of course, UVB provides vitamin D3 and all these other benefits. But that's an important part of the equation. I think that we don't want to block that nonlinear effect because that creates second and third order consequences for a system in general, especially the human body, which is very complex. Outside of that, you have the problem with light sensitivity, which is a very, very big problem from what I've seen. It arguably gets more hate and, you know, I guess more hate in general than sunscreen or any of the other topics, which is surprising. But through these intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells within the eyes that contain melanopsin, which is a blue light sensor, that's actually responsible for creating photoadaptation within the eyes. Otherwise, just adapting you to various light levels in the environment. And so when you're outside in bright light, you increase this melanopsin activation within those cells, and then you actually increase dopamine production in the eye as well to help with this photoadaptation. And so if you're chronically wearing sunglasses, you are going to create light sensitivity in the system. Whereas people think that, oh, it's just inherently the fact that I have light sensitive eyes, but you're actually creating the symptom that, you're dealing with. So that's another big one. UVA is interesting because we're actually all aromatic amino acids in the body absorb UV light structurally through benzene rings. And those aromatic amino acids are basically the precursors or the first step to creating various things like melatonin, dopamine, noradrenaline, adrenaline. So, quite literally, all of your foundational hormones and neurotransmitters rely on UV light absorption, fundamentally into the eyes peripherally and then onto the skin. And so go down the list. There's a bunch of these different things that we have to be concerned about, which is why I actively recommend most of the time without sunglasses. But if you are going to use them, I recommend them in environments that have a lot of glare. So on the water, high altitude with snow, anytime glare is actively present is generally when I'll recommend them, like no problem.
Mm. I've found, yeah, since I stopped using sunglasses, I think my vision's gotten stronger. I can tell. And as you said, the
Makes
ability,
sense.
photosensitivity is dramatically lessened uh, when leaving, darker spaces out into the sun. I adjust far more quickly. So look, it's another one of those things where people just have to try it for themselves and give it some time,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
let their
and
bodies
I've
be the
heard a lot
guide.
of people experience the same thing as well.
Yeah, just make as you just broke down, it makes not only biomechanistically complete sense. Uh, Said, is there anything like in this? I think there's so much that people can dive into, but is there anything you want to cover in particular and leave people with to think about? And if they're struggling with this, ways to get in touch and have it broken down simplistically for someone.
Mm. I would say we really have to understand that the entire notion that sunlight inherently causes skin cancer or photoaging is essentially a house of cards. Because if you go down into the root cause of how they're studying this work or the sun, they're using isolated UV on either in vitro skin cell cultures, nocturnal animals, and they're doing that using isolated UV in an artificially blue lab with a lot of non-native EMF around. And so that's not nature. That's not how circadian creatures work in nature. And so all of the assumptions that your centralized dermatologists or you know uh, practitioners, uh, all of those assumptions that they create or carry with them are done using that. And so that's, I think, a very flawed um, part of their philosophy that needs to really be tackled head on. And it doesn't explain what full spectrum does on a human being, which is a circadian creature. And so just consider that. Go into any of the research. Go into there's a high risk of skin cancer with sunlight exposure over a lifetime or something like that, and actively dig into the studies because I think you'll find that they're either associational, observational, or they're using isolated UV, and that's a very important thing for informed consent in my mind for a lot of people because they have to understand the history of this work. Now, outside of that, I just think that again the principles are very basic, like just watching sunrise, microdosing UV, building a tolerance, making it dark at night, which is where you actually repair the skin comprehensively. All of these things stack onto one another, and the most important thing is the circadian alignment so that you can get the most out of this work from any angle that you're focused on. So whether you're a mom, dad, athlete, it's going to carry huge, huge effects on your quality of life.
Before we finish, it came to mind melanoma aside, which I think is pretty categoric to my mind that you can't say that UV causes melanoma. Period. I think that's a complete fallacy. But in terms of what are your thoughts on BCCs, so lesser forms of skin cancer? Do you think there's more evidence to say that UV is more comprehensively involved in them manifesting?
I think basal and squamous cell carcinoma suffer from the same issues that melanoma does in terms of the centralized philosophy. Again, a lot of associational data, a lot of observational data. There has not been a single study in my mind from what I've seen that actually shows that full spectrum sunlight causes any form of skin cancer in human beings, which is crazy to think about. And like, I actively want people to prove me wrong because I've tried to find it. It just doesn't exist from what I've seen. And so, yeah, we have to consider that these are very complex disease manifestations. Any form of cancer is going to be multifactorial. And so that's why I bring out the idea that we have to look at the circadian disruption. the anti-cancer processes that are breaking down chronically. We have to look at the rancid seed oils that people are consuming most of their lives. Isolated blue light inside, lack of sunlight, all of these things play a huge role into these manifestations, and I think that it makes more sense. It's more directionally accurate than what centralized dermatology is trying to tell us.
So I'd love to actually do another one of these, another point with some questions from the audience, because I think that's a really, I think there's so much to chew on there for people. I have more questions, but I think I'll leave it there because there's more. I don't too much overwhelm, but you've got an absolutely incredible Instagram page for people, which I'll leave all the links in the bio for, where you really do lovely. Firstly, it's aesthetically beautiful, and then you show the science and you sort of do break it down in a very bite-sized, easy to understand, topic by topic. So I think that's a great place for people to start if they're curious. Is there any other? How else do you advocate for people to find you?
Yeah, so Substack or X, the links will be on my Instagram. So if that's linked, they'll be able to find their way there. But Substack is where I go a lot more in depth on specific topics, whether it be hyperpigmentation or type 2 diabetes from a circadian perspective. I'm starting to tackle a lot of these more complex manifestations like melasma or sunspots, quote unquote. And so that's, I think, a good place for people to start really diving deep.
Just anecdotally, like I get more sun than I ever have now, and I don't think my skin's ever been better. And or I don't get, I've certainly felt the onset of illnesses which dissipate fairly quickly, as opposed to when I look to when I was doing all the things I was told to do. I was inside a lot, barely got any sun, barely exposed my body to sun because I thought I'm saving it from aging, and I was sick all the time.
Yeah.
So
It makes
it's
sense, and I hear it so much. I hear it, a million times over.
yeah. I have to finish, Zaid. Who's in the Premier League? Who do you support? And give us your favourite player from all time.
I've always been an Arsenal
Oh
fan.
no! I'm
Yes, yes.
I'm Tottenham. That's
Oh,
hilarious.
so yeah, man.
Let's
Age
just
of 4. I mean, I just started supporting Arsenal. My dad was a huge Arsenal, and so
yeah.
obviously Thierry
That's
Henry, I think,
hilarious.
is at the top of the list.
Wow, not Burkamp.
Bergkamp was class, but I think
Oh
for
my god,
me
yeah.
personally, I would just follow Henry so much.
That team. We're going a bit off topic, but I love it. That team was unbelievable. That early thousands team that they had was such beautiful football with
Yeah.
Wenger and that team. Yeah.
Well, hey, even though we have a rivalry, I mean, you came out on top on this one in this year because you guys won the Europa League. So
No
we
one
came
really
home with
cares
nothing.
about. Yeah, but who really cares about Europa? Come on, they don't even field their top sides. Most of the top teams, we basically beat whatever the number 14th team.
I'm
Sorry,
looking
Spurs
forward to
fans.
next season though. It's going to be a fun one.
Yeah, well, it's going to be. There's be some shuffling from managers. Certainly, there's been some. Yeah, let's see.
Yeah,
Let's see. Say thank you so much for your time, and all links for this will be in the show notes. And love to do another round when we've got some questions from people to break down in further detail.
absolutely, brother. I appreciate you inviting me on.
No, pleasure. Pleasure's all mine.